In the last video, we got a kind of working definition of ideology on the table. In this video, we're going to ask the question that's more relevant for us, which is, can ideology affect science? So let's dig into that. And I'm going to make a case that there are certainly instances in the history of science where ideology had a pretty clear influence. This is not to say that ideology affects every single scientific project, but that it's certainly a potential influence in important ways on the progress of science. Okay, so recall this working definition from the last video. Let's call an ideology a conscious or unconscious set of unquestioned beliefs, usually pertaining to social or political values, usually shared by a group, which shape how we see the world. So going forward with that, can something like that, can your broad picture, your big picture idea of how society should be organized, can that affect the way science goes? I find it hard to see how this would affect things like astrophysics, but biology is pretty close to our hearts. It's a kind of subject that we know a lot about in the sense that we are living things, so we have lots of experience with living things. So I think biology is probably a good place to look if you want to see the influence of ideology on science. That's why I gave you the following thing to read this week. So the readings for this week are a chapter from Richard Lewontin's book, Biology as Ideology. Now, Lewontin is a biologist. He's a pretty well-known biologist. He's not coming at this from outside of the sciences. This is a critique from within science. I hope it's reasonably accessible. It's based on a series of lectures he gave for the CBC, so this is supposed to be publicly facing, not like one academic talking to another. And the main ideological assumption that he wants to challenge in this is what he calls biological determinism. Okay, so, but before we get to that, I'll come around to Lewontin's position in a bit. Before we get to that, I want to give you an example that I think is just absolutely clear of ideology having, in this case, a pretty detrimental effect on science. So we'll start with Lysenkoism. This is a really famous case. So knowing a bit of the history of science, you'll have heard of this. So Lysenko, Trofim Lysenko, pictured here, lived from 1889 to 1976, and he was a Soviet agronomist. That is, he's a food science, like a agricultural science guy. So before Darwin, to take an even further step back, before Darwin, Lamarck presented this theory of evolution, and it wasn't evolution by natural selection, but rather evolution by acquired characteristics. So you might ask, why do giraffes have this great long neck? Lamarck's answer was something like, because every generation the giraffes stretched. They stretched their necks to try to get the leaves that were high up. And when your parents stretch their neck gets a bit longer, and then they pass their long neck down onto you. So the inheritance of acquired characteristics. You acquire them during your life and then pass them on to the next generation. This is part of the Lamarckian picture. This is the Lamarckian picture of inheritance. Now, in the 1920s and 1930s in the Soviet Union, they were doing, they recently had a Marxist revolution, and they were also very hungry. So there was incredibly serious food shortages in this period. So food science was an amazingly important subject for them to study. They were studying it really hard. But at the time, they contrasted the bourgeois and racist Lamarckian picture with the more Marxist Mendelianism. So Lamarckianism was sort of like puts it on the individual to improve themselves and therefore improve the species, whereas Mendelianism was Marxist honestly for reasons that are unclear to me. I guess it's just puts less emphasis on individual accomplishment, whereas in the Marxist picture you want the sort of collective accomplishment. But along comes Lysenko, and Lysenko starts making the case in the 1930s for a different picture of heredity. And he does this via some food science, some agriculture science called vernalization. Okay, so some grains have to be planted in the winter, like they're going to grow in the spring, but some grains you have to put them in the ground in the winter, and they have to spend the winter in the ground before they can kind of blossom in the spring. So these are winter grains, but for a long time, farmers have known that if you put winter grains in sort of like cold and moist conditions, you can convince them to grow after you've planted them in the spring. So that's called vernalization. You take a grain that's usually going to spend the winter in the ground, give it some cold, give it some moisture, and you can convince it to grow after you've just planted it in the spring. So Lysenko's aware of this, and then he comes up with this theory where you can not just do this once, but if you do it over and over again, you can compound the effect. You get better and better crops every year if you repeat the process of vernalization. So this is a version of the kind of Lamarckian picture of inheritance, where your life experiences change what you pass on to the next generation. And from the 1930s forward, this view of heredity becomes that acquired characteristics can be inherited, becomes in some sense like mandated by the Soviet Union. So because they see it as more in line with their picture of what people are like, disagreeing with them essentially becomes illegal. So the view that environment shapes us more than genetics came to be seen as, I mean, it went through like, first it was Marxist to be Mendelian, that is, believe in sort of non-acquired characteristics, and then they flipped. But during Lysenko's sort of ascendancy, it became viewed as better Marxism to say that your environment changes who you are on a fundamental level. So the Soviet Union Marxists saw problems like violence or alcoholism or sexism as products of the environment, right? So that if you change the structure of society, you'd change people's behaviors. Their behaviors weren't written into their genes in some sense. You could change in some way human nature by changing the organization of society. So the modern synthesis says, Mendelian genetics says something like, no, your genes are just your genes. That's what's passed on. You can't change your genetic inheritance, so it doesn't really matter how you change the environment. You're just going to end up with the same thing. So from about 1948 on, it becomes, in some sense, illegal to disagree with Lysenko. So there's a scientific debate going on all through the early 20th century about how inheritance works, how genetics works. They haven't discovered the kind of structure of DNA yet, so there's big, serious questions about this. But the Soviet Union decides on one type of answer for essentially political reasons. And it's not that there's nothing at all to the idea of the inheritance of acquired characteristics for complex reasons that we won't go into. That idea is actually having something of a revival. So there seems to be some parts of your experience that are passed down to the next generation. But the debate was not closed off because they had excellent scientific evidence. The debate in this case was closed off because one view seemed to ring better with the Marxist picture of history and society than the other. So I think this is just an unquestionable case of politics in the sense of ideology stepping in and stifling scientific debate. Okay, so I hope you agree that was, I mean, if you look into this case a little more deeply, I'm only able to skim over it here, but I hope you agree that was a pretty clear case of ideology influencing science, and in this case in a pretty bad way, right? So if you're just like, if your government mandates one scientific theory over another because it sounds better from their political perspective, that's not science doing its job, right? That's science being stifled by ideology. Okay, so the ideologies that Lewinson deals with in this book are not Marxist, but in some sense the opposite. So he's arguing against the idea that our genes kind of determine us in some sense. So genetic determinism, or biological determinism as he sometimes talks about it, is an idea that's been around for quite some time. And Lewinson thinks that as being sort of ideologically projected onto the science in a way that's somewhat similar to the the Lysenko problem. Okay, so here's a really old idea, and Lewinson doesn't talk about this, but I think it's good context. It's called the Great Chain of Being. This is kind of a medieval European idea that there's a kind of natural hierarchy in the world. At the very top, there's of course God. Just below God, there's sort of angels. I guess there's a couple orders of angels. There's like the best angels and then the okay angels. And then there's people below that, and then animals and plants, and you can go all the way down to hell, which is the worst. So it's a kind of moral hierarchy that every living thing is organized into. And if you know a little bit about medieval European history, this was a feudal society. That is, there's no notion of sort of, rising through the ranks, the American dream, or anything like that. There's a noble classes, so kings and queens and dukes and princesses and so on. And you were born into nobility. You would die in nobility if you're lucky. I mean, assuming nothing goes terribly wrong for you. And the nobility were understood as being closer to God than the peasants, who they didn't exactly own, but like they owned all the land. The nobility were understood to be the natural leaders of society. And nobility is passed through the blood. That is, you get to be a noble person because your parents were noble people. It was understood to run in family. So this closeness to God was understood to be inherited. Okay? And that closeness to God determines your place in society, your proper place in society. The view at this time was everything will be fine if everybody stays in their place. Nobles stay noble, peasants stay peasants, right? So there's no mixing of the classes here. Everybody's got a proper place in the great chain of being, and well-run societies are those that respect that. Okay, so this is a very old idea, but I would suggest that it kind of echoes through the way we interpret inheritance to this very day. So, I mean, it's been a while since we've been working on the idea of heredity. Just for fun, here's an early concept called preformationism or preformationism. Sort of late 1600s, this image is from. And the belief was that inside an individual sperm is a tiny little person. And that tiny little person is sort of fully formed as a person. You got all their organs and arms and legs and everything. And when somebody becomes pregnant, it's just that person just gets bigger. And in fact, the tiny little person in the sperm has tiny little testicles with even tinier little sperms in them, with even tinier little people in them. So on this view, basically the whole history of humanity was contained in, so if you believe in Adam and Eve, Adam had sperms with like all of the people who were going to be born in for the rest of history in those, in little tiny Russian dolls within sperms. This is incorrect. This view is not quite correct. So Darwin had a different view. Darwin had this view called pangenesis, where all of the different parts of your body would contribute tiny little bits of genetic material called gemmules. And those gemmules from all your different parts would kind of collect into your gonads. And then, so either an egg or a sperm. And then those are what's contributed to the next generation. Now, I hope you know that this isn't correct either. So Darwin didn't know how heredity works, but you can tell this isn't correct because if a mother and father who have both had, their left hand removed won't have children without a left hand. You get the left hand in the child, right? So it's pretty clear that this isn't how things work either. But, this was Darwin's view. So, of course, the modern notion of heredity is centered around DNA. There's a bunch of debate about what should count as inherited, but nobody doubts that DNA is one of the most important central things that you inherit from the previous generation. But Lewinson wants us to note that throughout this development of our notion of heredity, there's still a bit of the old great chain of being hiding in the background. So DNA stays constant throughout your life, right? So that's the point of this sort of like germplasm theory that the things that you experience throughout your life don't really affect your DNA. Sometimes you can acquire little mutations, but most of the time your DNA is your DNA. You get it from your parents and you pass it on to your kids pretty much unchanged. Lewontin wants us to think about the bodies that we have as much more complex than just programmed by our DNA. He insists that there are complex interaction between the DNA that you inherit, the environment that you inherited in, and the developmental process that you went through. That is, going from an embryo to an adult is development. And of course, there are lots of things that can happen in there. So the overall bodies that we build depend on a lot more than just sort of programming by our DNA. When we think about heritability, it's really common to talk about degrees of heritability. So here's a definition of degrees of heritability, and I want you to think pretty carefully about this because it's very often misused, and I think it's often misused in ways that reflect kind of an ideological background. Okay, so the proportion of variance in a particular trait in a particular population that is due to genetic factors, as opposed to environmental influences or stochastic variation. Okay, so the degree of heritability, and people often talk about, for example, the degree of heritability of intelligence or height or other properties that we care about human beings. So let's just go through an example to think through this definition. Suppose we've got 4 plants and they're grown in exactly the same environment. So they get the same soil and light and water, everything. We've got them in a lab, and we can even take these 4 plants and clone them. So you take a little cutting, it's genetically identical to the one you've cut it off of, and regrow it. And suppose that in these conditions, over and over and over again, we get 2 plants that are pretty tall and 2 plants that are pretty short. Okay, so the variance in their height is, which 2 are tall and which 2 are short. So that variance is, in this case, got to be due to genetic factors because we held everything else constant, right? All of the environment was exactly constant, and we've done a bunch of generations, so we know that that variation isn't due to some weird developmental accident. So in this case, 100% of the variation in the plant height is due to genetics. But does that mean that the plant's heights are fixed? Well, no, not at all. So even 100% heritable traits can vary dramatically given a different environment. So if we change the light levels or change the pH of the soil or change the amount of airflow they get, it could easily be the case that the plants that used to be the tall ones become the short ones, and the ones that used to be the short ones become the tall ones. So with change of environment, even things that are 100% heritable, maximally heritable, are very, very changeable. This is the point that Lewontin makes throughout this chapter, that being heritable doesn't mean, so being in the DNA doesn't mean that a thing is unchangeable. So he says quite explicitly, there is no connection whatsoever between the variation that can be ascribed to genetic differences as opposed to environmental differences and whether a change in environment will affect their performance and by how much. So think about mathematical ability. It seems that there is some degree to which mathematical ability is heritable. That is, if your parents are good at math, it's reasonably likely that you'll be good at math. But notice that you can radically change people's mathematical ability by changing their environment. So the averagest high school student can, with a calculator, can absolutely demolish the best ancient mathematicians in terms of like multiplying 5-digit numbers or something like that, right? So, a school kid with a calculator would demolish Pythagoras in terms of just doing calculations because the environment changed. So you can absolutely change things that are 100% heritable. You can absolutely change them by changing the environment. That's just a difference between the way that we understand the word heritability in a kind of common colloquial sense and how it's biologically defined. You might at this point think that the calculator example is a bit unfair, you say, because what we're really interested in is unaided ability. Oh, I want to know what about the Pythagoras versus the school kid without the calculator. But Lewontin argues that there's really no such thing as unaided ability, especially not for our genes. Like, if you doubt this, feel free to extract some DNA from the smartest person that you know and see how well those strands of DNA do at math. I bet those unaided DNA strands are going to do very poorly at math, right? If the smartest person that you know was raised by wolves, they're going to be pretty bad at math, right? We don't actually care about unaided ability. That's not relevant to any of us. What we care about is how well people flourish in a given environment. So unaided ability is a bit of a red herring here. Okay, so if that's correct, if all that's right, what Lewontin is arguing, the good old great chain of being idea is very poorly represented in modern biology. That is to say, modern biology doesn't give us any good reason to believe that there's a kind of natural hierarchy of people, that some people are just intrinsically better at stuff than other people. Really what it gives us is an incredibly complex interaction between environment, heredity, development, all this stuff, where we shouldn't think that any given person has just one set of potentials. We've got this unbelievably vast set of potentials that could be unlocked by sometimes even slightly different environments. So our genes are biologically important. I don't think anybody doubts that genes have a crucial biological role to play, but they don't tell us what our destiny is. But that hasn't stopped a bunch of people in the history of science from acting as though they do. So I want to try to show that in at least some cases that good old great chain of being idea is active in the background. Okay, so for those of you who hasn't looked at this in a while, here's Darwin's theory of evolution in the shortest form that I can put it. So the question he wanted to answer is, why are living things so nicely fitted to their environment? The old answer was because God made them that way. Darwin's answer goes something like this. If you have each of these three factors, then each generation is likely to become slightly better fitted to its environment. So if there's variation in the population, so not everybody's the same, you've got some differences between the individuals, that variation is heritable to some degree, and heritable variations are linked to different rates of reproductive success. So some traits make you more likely to have children that'll have children. Okay, and that's it. If you get those three things together, Darwin says, and modern biology agrees, you're going to get a species that's undergoing natural selection and therefore gets fitted to its environment. It's pretty simple, right? Like, at its core, it's a very simple theory, which I think is what made it so apt for people to project their ideological views onto it. So Darwin was a little dismayed at this even at the time of his writing. So he writes the following. He says in a letter, he says, "I've received in a Manchester newspaper a rather good squib showing that I have proved, quote, might is right, and therefore that Napoleon is right, and every cheating tradesman is often right." So people immediately read Darwin as this theory, this sort of like three things, as showing that, morality is a joke, and you should eat your neighbor if you get the chance, and cheating is great, and all this stuff. Darwin didn't think any of that was in his theory. Another particularly concerning consequence that people tried to draw out of Darwinism was eugenics. So one of Darwin's cousins, Francis Galton, which I've mentioned before, decided that Darwin's theory proved that we need to try to make the species better, basically by trying to get certain people to have more kids and certain people to have less. So the history of eugenics is a profoundly ugly one, and seems to be one of the most visible, to my mind, it's the most obvious place where ideology is just being directly projected onto the science. And people think that the science tells them what their ideology is telling them, but it's just them sort of putting it on there. So let's look at one of Galton's arguments and consider it. So Okay, so here's the kind of, I mean, this is very rough. He didn't use these words exactly, but here's the rough argument that Galton used for eugenics. The rich are rich because they have good genes, obviously, right? The poor are poor because they have genes that dispose them to laziness, criminality, alcoholism, and so on. Been a very common view throughout history. But the poor, if you look at the demographics, are having more children than the rich. Therefore, the rich should be encouraged to have more kids and the poor discouraged, often by involuntary sterilization or, in the case of the Nazi regime, genocide. And here poor, I mean, you can fit in for rich and poor whatever desirable or undesirable people that you can think of. So if you think a certain race is undesirable, you slot that in. If you think a certain class is undesirable, you slot that in. Whatever you kind of like already thought were the good people and the bad people, you can fit into those places in the argument. But notice something about this argument. In this case, the poor have more children than the rich. Well, according to Darwin's theory of evolution, that makes them fitter. That's the definition of fitness, having children, having like more children. So Galton has made this argument kind of in defiance of Darwinian theory. He's obviously only able to hold this all in his head because he's got some non-Darwinian notion of fitness, by which he must mean like goodness or the people that I like, right? The very definition of fitness is having more kids. So it's completely contradictory to say the rich people are fitter, therefore, but they're having fewer kids. Yeah. Group A is fitter, but they're having fewer kids is a strict contradiction according to Darwinian theory. So something is providing a notion of goodness to this argument that doesn't come from Darwinian theory, and I think you can guess what that is. I would say it's some version of the good old great chain of being. Rich people are rich because they're closer to God or they're just better people, and poor people are down low because that's where they should stay. And basically what Galton is concerned about here is society being overturned. He likes things the way they are, doesn't want them to change. So I know of few clearer examples. I mean, the Lysenko example is up here. Galton's eugenics arguments are really at the top of the clear cases of somebody's pre-existing social and political and values beliefs influencing the way they read the science. Here's a completely different take on Darwinism, and it's by Alfred Russel Wallace, who pretty much discovered the theory of evolution by natural selection at the exact same time as Darwin. So Wallace writes to Darwin, hey, I've had this really good idea, evolution by natural selection, and Darwin goes, oh, I should really publish that book before this guy does. Okay, so Wallace knows the theory of evolution as well as anybody. He invented it, along with Darwin. Wallace thinks that the theory of evolution has the following consequences. Groups which cooperate are more efficient than groups that compete within the group. Therefore, cooperation will take over the world. Furthermore, inheritance interferes within group selection, so it should be abolished. That is inheritance of money. So he thinks the inheritance of wealth should be abolished because it interferes with good old-fashioned natural selection. And furthermore, the subjugation of women interferes with natural selection. So it also should be abolished. So Wallace has got this quite progressive social ideology, which he thinks comes straight out of the theory of evolution by natural selection. Pretty much the opposite, or completely different in many, many ways from the social and political vision that Galton thinks comes out of Darwin. So the point of all that was the following. I think that there are unquestionable cases, or at least very, very strong cases, where ideology had a profound impact on the way people received scientific theories. And this is an ongoing danger. These are the clearest cases I could think of. There are many sort of less subtle or less obvious cases, more subtle cases. And the danger, I would argue, is proportional to your degree of awareness of this. So for good or ill, the unknown knowns that structure your attention are going to shape the way that you see the world. Your beliefs, your social values are going to have potential impacts on the way that you're understanding science. And if you aren't aware of that, if you're sort of like allowing them to be unknown knowns rather than things that you can bring into conscious awareness and maybe criticize and ask whether there are other ways of thinking, then you're more likely to just mistake your value judgments for facts about the world, sort of facts in the world given by scientific theories like the theory of evolution, rather than a way you have of interpreting the science according to your way of seeing things. Okay, that's it for this week. Thanks.